So I want you to picture this. It is 170 AD.
Okay.
It is the dead of night. We are out on the freezing, just mud-soaked front lines of the war in Germania.
Oh, wow. Setting the scene.
Right. And sitting inside this canvas tent, breathing in the smell of, wood smoke and damp earth, is Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of the Roman Empire.
The most powerful man in the world at that time.
Exactly. He's sitting at the small table and he's writing, but he isn't drafting like a fiery speech for the Senate back in Rome. He's not writing a manifesto to be published.
No, not at all.
He is writing purely to himself. He is essentially just trying to make sense of the immense crushing burden of his own life.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is.
Yeah.
And in this private journal, which we now know as Meditations, he takes all the complex philosophies of his mentors and distills them down. He writes what might be the ultimate formula for overcoming, well, literally any negative situation human beings ever face.
Yeah, the ultimate mic drop moment.
Exactly. He concludes the thought with this profound realization that is basically going to serve as the engine for our entire deep dive today. He writes, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way."
It really is a staggering realization to just stumble upon it in a private diary, especially when you consider who was actually holding the pen.
Right.
I mean, we so often hear these ancient quotes and we imagine them being spoken by philosophers lounging around in marble gardens, sipping wine.
Yeah, just having a nice relaxed afternoon.
Exactly. But Marcus Aurelius was writing from a place of absolute sustained crisis.
Oh, completely.
He endured a nearly 2-decade reign that was characterized by just almost unrelenting chaos.
Yeah.
He faced constant border wars, the Antonine Plague, which, by the way, was wiping out a huge portion of his population, severe floods in Rome, a rapidly depleting treasury, and even the deeply personal betrayal of a rebellion led by one of his most trusted friends.
It's just catastrophe after catastrophe.
Right. He was the most powerful man in the known world, yet he was surrounded by circumstances over which he had incredibly limited control.
And the main thesis of the sources we are diving into today, specifically extracting these core insights from Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is the Way, is that Marcus didn't just grit his teeth and merely survive that chaos.
No. He did something entirely different.
Right. He used every single one of those catastrophes as a specific, tailored opportunity to practice a virtue.
Exactly.
Like, if the treasury was empty, okay, that was a chance to practice resourcefulness. If a friend betrayed him, which happened, it was an arena to practice forgiveness. He basically pioneered this operational framework for turning obstacles completely upside down.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
It is. And so before we go any further, I actually want to ask you, the listener, to bring your own life into this tent with Marcus. Think about the most agonizing, frustrating roadblocks sitting in front of you right now.
Yeah, really picture it.
Maybe it's a suffocating corporate bureaucracy that's just stifling your career. Maybe you're dealing with a sudden, devastating health diagnosis. Or, perhaps you poured your life savings into a business and the market just completely collapsed out from under you.
Which happens all the time.
It does. But what if that specific painful problem wasn't just a detour? What if it wasn't just something you had to miserably endure? What if it was inherently, biologically, and structurally beneficial to you?
I think we need to set a hard boundary right here at the outset, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when we explore this philosophy, we are entirely discarding the modern obsession with toxic positivity.
Yes, thank goodness.
Right. We're not advocating for putting on a fake smile or ignoring your pain or, repeating hollow affirmations in the mirror. That's just delusion.
It's just lying to yourself.
Exactly. What we are exploring here is a philosophy of ruthless, cold-blooded pragmatism. Inherited from the ancient Stoics. It is an operating system that has been deployed by people facing unimaginable adversity. I mean, from civil rights leaders facing down systemic violence to pioneers venturing into the brutal American West. It is the mechanical, step-by-step process of learning how to extract strategic advantage from misfortune.
So how do we actually do that? Well, the sources outline a deeply interconnected 3-part discipline.
Right, the roadmap for today.
Exactly. It begins with how our brain physically and psychologically interprets the world, our perception. Then, once we clear the fog of our own panic, we have to physically dismantle the problem, which is our action.
Yeah.
And finally, when we are stripped of all agency and the problem is truly genuinely immovable, we have to rely on our internal endurance. our will.
Perception, action, will.
But we cannot take a single step forward. We can't formulate a plan if we are paralyzed by our own biology. So we have to start by examining the mechanics of perception.
And perception really is just the lens through which we view reality. But the thing is, the human lens is evolutionarily distorted.
Right, it's outdated hardware.
Exactly. Our brains are hardwired for survival in a prehistoric landscape. The amygdala, the fear center of the brain, is primed to detect threats and initiate a fight-or-flight response.
Which is great if a tiger is chasing you.
Exactly. That was highly effective when the threat was a predator in the tall grass. But today, when your boss sends an aggressive email at 11 p.m., or when a major client pulls their contract,
your brain reacts the same way.
Right. Your brain floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline. You experience a biological fear response to what is essentially a non-lethal psychological stressor.
Yeah, no one is actually going to eat you.
No.
Yeah.
But those unhelpful perceptions, the panic, the rage, the despair, they physically alter your cognitive function. They create tunnel vision.
You literally can't see straight.
Exactly. They prevent you from seeing the peripheral opportunities that are hidden within the crisis. We have to learn to neurologically separate the reliable data of a situation from the deceptive alarm bells of our own evolutionary baggage.
Which is so hard to do. But the sources bring up this fascinating look at how this is handled in environments where that tunnel vision is literally fatal. They look at NASA's astronaut training protocol.
Oh, this is such a great example.
Right. Just think about the environment of space. You are strapped into a tiny metal capsule sitting on top of millions of pounds of explosive fuel.
Basically a controlled bomb.
Exactly. Preparing to be launched into a vacuum where there is no oxygen, no gravity, and absolutely no immediate rescue.
Yeah, terrifying.
If you experience the natural human biological response if you panic, you die. If your heart rate spikes and you lose your cognitive flexibility, you might hit the wrong sequence on the instrument panel. You deviate from the flight plan.
And that's game over.
So NASA cannot just hire people who, claim to be brave. They have to physically rewire their astronauts' nervous systems. They use a process of graded exposure.
They basically beat the fear out of them through repetition.
Exactly. They put astronauts in centrifuges to simulate the crushing G-force of liftoff. They put them in massive neutral buoyancy pools for hours to simulate weightlessness. They introduce them to every single flashing light, every blaring alarm, and every violent vibration thousands of times.
Because they're essentially inoculating the brain against uncertainty.
Right.
Panic is almost always the offspring of the unknown. By the time a NASA astronaut actually launches, the chaotic, terrifying environment of a rocket launch has become, almost mundane.
Like another day at the office?
Yeah. The psychological term for this is habituation. The uncertainty is systematically replaced by authority and training. And it's interesting because the ancient Greeks, particularly the Stoics, they developed a specific psychological state akin to this. They called it apatheia.
No, wait, apatheia, that sounds like apathy.
It does, and that's the modern English derivative. But apathy implies a depressing lack of interest, right? Or a numbing of all feeling.
Like you just don't care about anything.
Exactly. But the original concept of apatheia was something entirely different. It was a profound, calm equanimity. It was the absolute freedom from irrational, harmful emotions.
Okay, so not dead inside, just calm.
Right. It is the cognitive state where you acknowledge the flashing alarms, but your internal resting heart rate remains utterly undisturbed. Like when John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth, and during the intense physical and psychological stress of that totally unknown frontier, his telemetry showed his heart rate rarely elevated above 100 beats per minute.
That is insane.
That is apatheia in action.
Okay, but let me interrupt this really quickly because this is the exact point where I think people listening, and honestly myself included, start to roll our eyes a bit.
Fair enough.
Because we are not John Glenn. We don't have NASA's billion-dollar simulation facilities to train us for our daily lives.
No, we definitely don't.
If I am a small business owner and my supplier suddenly doubles their prices overnight, completely bankrupting my quarterly projections, I am going to feel a visceral spike of anger and terror. That is my livelihood.
Of course you are.
So are we honestly suggesting that the goal here is to just stand there like a lifeless robot and pretend the pain doesn't exist? Because that feels bordering on insulting to everyday human struggle.
And it would be insulting if the goal were suppression.
Yeah.
But real psychological strength is never about pretending emotions do not exist.
Okay.
Suppression is fragile. It always eventually explodes. What the Stoics practiced and what the sources emphasize is the domestication of emotion.
Domestication, I like that.
Right. You're a human being. You are going to feel that initial physiological spike of terror when the supplier doubles the prices. If the stress is overwhelming, you might need to go for a run, punch a heavy bag, or even cry. The goal isn't to eradicate the feeling.
It's what you do next.
Exactly. The goal is to refuse to let the feeling sit in the driver's seat. You experience the emotion, but you immediately challenge it with cold logic. You ask yourself, does allowing this panic to dictate my next email provide me with more leverage?
And the answer is basically always no.
Right. It's no. You remind yourself, I am not going to physically die from this supply chain issue. The domestication of emotion means putting a leash on the panic so that your higher reasoning center can get back to the work of finding a new supplier.
I really want to dig into that specific technique of challenging the emotion because there's an incredible concept here from the 16th century Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi.
Oh, this is brilliant.
Right. This was a man who survived countless lethal duels, often against multiple armed opponents, and sometimes wielding nothing more than a wooden training sword.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And in his seminal text, The Book of Five Rings, he outlines this crucial difference between what he calls the observing eye and the perceiving eye.
Right.
The observing eye is the ultimate weapon because it simply registers data. It sees exactly what is physically there, the angle of the opponent's blade, the distance to the wall.
Just the facts.
Just the facts. But the perceiving eye is weak because it is burdened by narrative. It brings all your insecurities, your ego, and your fear into the present moment. The perceiving eye looks at the opponent and thinks, oh man, this guy has killed 10 people. He is famous. I am tired. If I lose, I will be humiliated.
It tells a whole scary story.
Exactly. The perceiving eye layers a terrifying legend on top of what is really just a simple physical problem.
And that legend is entirely manufactured in our own minds. We do this constantly in modern life, don't we?
Oh, all the time.
We don't just see an angry email from a client. The observing eye says, here's an email with some capitalized words. But the perceiving eye tells us the story that we are a fraud, that our business is failing, and that we will end up totally destitute.
Spiraling out of control.
Right. So to cultivate Musashi's observing eye, the Stoics utilized a deeply practical, somewhat humorous exercise they called contemptuous expressions.
I love this one.
It's so good. The underlying mechanism of this exercise is to systematically strip the glamour, the intimidation, and the subjective narrative away from external objects or people. The philosopher Epictetus used to advise his students whenever they were feeling intimidated by the grand reputation of a famous thinker or a politician.
Yeah.
He'd tell them to picture that highly revered person awkwardly performing basic biological functions.
Just go into the bath.
Exactly. It instantly shatters the aura of infallibility.
It is such an amazing mental hack. And Marcus Aurelius practiced this obsessively at the absolute height of imperial luxury.
Which is the hardest place to practice it.
Truly. He would sit at a state banquet surrounded by the wealthiest patricians in Rome, and he would look at an exquisite, expensive dish of roasted meat. And instead of marveling at the culinary achievement, he would instruct his mind to see it objectively. He'd say, this is the dead, roasted corpse of a bird.
Just stripping it down.
Yeah. He would look at a priceless amphora of vintage Falernian wine and tell himself, this is just the fermented juice of crushed grapes. He looked at the purple robes of royalty, which was the ultimate symbol of status back then, and reminded himself, this is just sheep's wool dyed with the mucus of shellfish.
That really takes the majesty right out of it.
It completely ruins the vibe, but in the best way. And the utility of this is staggering when you apply it to our own lives. If you have a critic, a competitor, or a boss who makes you feel physically small, you just deploy the observing eye. You strip their power away. You realize that they are not a mythical monster. They are just a flawed, biological human being who struggles with their own insecurities, who gets indigestion, and who puts their pants on one leg at a time. You remove the intimidating narrative, and you're left with only the objective reality.
And when you master the ability to look at a terrifying reality objectively, you unlock a massive strategic advantage. I mean, the sources point to a defining moment in the life of John D. Rockefeller to really illustrate the sheer power of this cognitive discipline.
The Panic of 1857.
Exactly. So in 1855, Rockefeller was essentially a nobody. He was 16 years old, living in Cleveland, Ohio. His father was a notorious con artist and bigamist who had effectively abandoned the family, leaving them in a really precarious financial state.
Tough start.
Very. So young Rockefeller secures a grueling job as a junior bookkeeper, earning like 50 cents a day. He is just beginning to understand the mechanics of business. And then 2 years later, the Panic of 1857 strikes.
And this was bad.
It was a devastating national financial contagion. Railroads failed, banks collapsed, grain prices plummeted, and thousands of businesses were shuttered. The entire economic expansion of the United States just ground to a sudden, terrifying halt.
So let's put ourselves in his shoes for a second. You are 18 years old, you have absolutely no safety net, your father is gone, and the entire economic infrastructure of your city is collapsing.
It's a nightmare.
The natural perceiving eye response is absolute panic. Most young men in his position would have abandoned the volatile world of finance entirely, sought manual labor on a farm, or simply despaired.
Yeah, just run away.
But Rockefeller exhibited this bizarre, almost unnatural coolness under pressure. While the seasoned businessmen of Cleveland were literally running through the streets trying to pull their money out of failing banks, Rockefeller chose to sit still and eagerly observe the mechanics of the chaos.
Just watching.
He didn't look at the Depression as a tragedy that was happening to him. He reframed it as an unparalleled real-time education. He realized that the market was inherently vicious, deeply irrational, and entirely unpredictable. But more importantly, he realized that in a landscape driven by blind panic, the only entity capable of profiting was the hyper-rational, objective mind.
He was observing the behavioral economics of a panic a century before the term even existed.
Right.
And he formalized this discipline. Years later, when he was 25, a group of frantic investors offered him a massive sum, about $500,000, to rapidly deploy into the booming oil fields of Pennsylvania.
Which was huge money back then.
Massive. It was a total gold rush atmosphere. Everyone was getting rich, and the pressure to buy in immediately was immense. So Rockefeller takes the train out to the fields, spends a few days just observing the drilling operations, the logistics, and the manic behavior of the prospectors.
Doing his homework.
Right. And then he gets back on the train, returns to his investors, and hands back every single cent.
He just walks away.
He walked away from $500,000. Because objectively, without the distortion of FOMO, that fear of missing out, the foundational logistics of the opportunity just did not make sense to him. He refused to let the greed of the crowd dictate his actions.
He kept the observing eye.
He maintained the observing eye, prioritizing long-term infrastructure over short-term speculation. And within 2 decades, by maintaining that icy objectivity during both booms and busts, his company, Standard Oil, controlled nearly 90% of the American oil market.
Wow.
His competitors were constantly destroyed by their own emotional reactivity, but Rockefeller thrived purely on his perception.
That is an incredible example of deploying perception to build an empire. But, the true test of this philosophy isn't just about making money when the market crashes.
No, it goes much deeper.
What happens when your physical agency is violently stripped from you? The sources delve into the harrowing, honestly almost unbelievable story of Reuben Hurricane Carter.
Such a powerful story.
In the mid-1960s, Carter was at the absolute peak of his life. He was a devastatingly powerful middleweight boxer, a top contender for the world championship, driving custom cars, wearing tailored suits, just living the American dream.
He had it all.
And then, in a devastating instant, it was entirely ripped away. He was wrongly accused of a horrific triple homicide in a bar in New Jersey. The trial was a total sham, deeply tainted by racism and manufactured evidence. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences.
Just heartbreaking.
He went from a celebrated athlete to a number in a maximum security prison, facing the prospect of dying in a concrete cage for a crime he did not commit.
It really is the ultimate manifestation of the immovable obstacle. The sensory deprivation, the loss of autonomy, the sheer volume of the injustice. It is literally designed to break the human psyche. The whole architecture of a prison is built to enforce compliance through degradation.
But Carter's response is a masterclass in the absolute sovereignty of the human mind. The day he reports to Raleigh State Prison, he doesn't shuffle in looking defeated.
No, he doesn't.
He walks in wearing a tailored, expensive suit, a $5,000 diamond ring, and a gold watch. He stands in the processing line, reaches the warden, looks him dead in the eye, and delivers a profound declaration of independence.
What'd he say?
He essentially states, "I know you did not personally cause this injustice. I am willing to reside in this facility until my legal team gets me out, but I will not, under any circumstances, be treated as a prisoner. I am not a guilty man, and I am not powerless."
Goosebumps.
Right. And he then backed up that statement with radical, unimaginable discipline. He flatly refused to put on the striped prison uniform. He refused to eat the slop served in the cafeteria. He refused to accept visitors, including his own wife, because he would not subject them to the humiliation of a glass partition.
Wow.
He even refused to attend parole hearings, which are the only standard mechanism for early release, because applying for parole requires an admission of guilt. He wouldn't even work in the prison commissary to earn privileges.
To understand the psychological mechanics of what Carter was doing, we really have to look past the surface defiance. Was he filled with blinding rage? Absolutely.
Anyone would be.
But he understood that unleashing that rage on a prison guard with a baton was a tactical error. It would only result in solitary confinement and a broken body. Carter realized a fundamental philosophical truth. The state possessed his physical body. They controlled the doors, the lights, the food. But they did not have access to his inner citadel. They could not touch his mind, his attitude, or his deeply held beliefs unless he voluntarily surrendered them. He realized that a concrete cell, in and of itself, is entirely neutral.
It's just concrete and steel.
Exactly. It is neither good nor bad. It is only the judgment of the occupant that labels it a hell. As Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
That's perfect.
Carter refused to let the New Jersey penal system dictate his reality. Instead of pacing his cell in despair, he repurposed it. He used the solitude to become a legal scholar. He read every law book, philosophy text, and history manuscript he could get his hands on. He used the injustice as a forge to reconstruct his own intellect.
He basically weaponized his confinement.
Wow.
And when he finally walked out of those gates 19 years later, after the federal courts finally overturned his conviction, he did something that astounded everyone.
Yeah, this part is wild.
He didn't sue the state for a massive settlement. He didn't demand a groveling apology from the prosecutors. He just walked away.
Which confuses a lot of people.
It does. But why? Because to demand an apology is to acknowledge that they had taken something of value from him. Carter's perception was so ironclad that he genuinely believed they had never truly touched his core identity. His mind had remained perfectly free for those entire 19 years.
And if Reuben Carter can locate his agency and control his perception while enduring 2 decades of false imprisonment, it completely invalidates the excuses we make in our daily lives.
Oh, 100%.
The sources emphasize that altering our perspective is always within our power, no matter the industry or the obstacle. We often operate under a delusion that our success is entirely dependent on the whims of gatekeepers. Seth Godin calls this the tyranny of being picked.
Right, waiting for permission.
We wait for a boss to promote us, a publisher to buy our book, an investor to fund our startup. We place ourselves in a posture of weakness, basically begging for validation.
Which brings up the brilliant example of George Clooney early in his career.
Oh, I love this story.
For years, Clooney was just a struggling actor in Hollywood. He went to hundreds of auditions and was constantly rejected. And he was miserable. He was caught in that exact tyranny. He was walking into casting rooms, projecting desperation, subconsciously begging the producers, please like me, please give me a shot.
And they can smell that desperation.
Exactly. He perceived the casting directors as these omnipotent judges holding his entire self-worth in their hands. But then he radically altered his framework. He realized something fundamental about the industry. Casting directors are not sitting there hoping to ruin actors' lives. Casting directors have a massive, stressful problem.
They need to cast the movie.
Right. They have a multi-million-dollar production, a demanding director, and a looming schedule, and they desperately need to find the right person for the role so they don't get fired. They're praying that the next person who walks through the door is the answer.
It completely flips the dynamic.
It does. Clooney stopped walking into rooms as a beggar, asking for a favor. He started walking into rooms projecting that he was the absolute solution to their agonizing problem. He wasn't arrogant. He just shifted the dynamic. He assumed the posture of an equal partner offering a service. He changed his perception of the power dynamic, and his entire career trajectory shifted.
He stopped focusing on the subjective opinions of others, which he could not control, and focused entirely on his own presentation, which he could.
Right.
This relates directly to the Stoic concept of the dichotomy of control, which really is the foundational operating system of this entire philosophy. Epictetus taught that our chief task in life is simply to divide things into 2 categories: external things that are not up to us and internal choices that are.
Sounds simple enough.
Simple, but not easy. The sources highlight Tommy John, the legendary Major League Baseball pitcher, to illustrate the extreme application of this principle. So in the middle of the 1974 season, Tommy John suffered a catastrophic injury. He completely blew out his ulnar collateral ligament in his pitching elbow.
Wow.
Yeah. And in the 1970s, a dead arm injury for a pitcher wasn't a setback. It was a career death sentence. Medical science had no standard fix for it.
His perceiving eye could have easily concluded that his life's work was over, but he sat down with the team doctor, Dr. Frank Jobe, and asked for his options.
What did the doctor say?
The doctor proposed a radical experimental surgery, taking a tendon from his other arm and literally weaving it into his elbow. The catch: even if the surgery went perfectly, the doctor gave him a 1 in 100 chance of ever pitching in the major leagues again. 99% probability of absolute failure.
This is where the discipline of perception meets the stark reality of statistics. Most people look at a 99% failure rate and surrender.
Understandably so.
Right. They allow the statistical impossibility, which is outside their control, to dictate their attitude. Tommy John utilized the logic found in the Serenity Prayer, which is famous in addiction recovery circles. Possessing the courage to change what you can, the serenity to accept what you cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference. Tommy John could not control the fact that his ligament tore. He could not control the fragility of the human body. He could not change the 99% probability of surgical failure. Those were the externals. But that narrow, terrifying 1% chance, that 1% resided entirely in the realm of his own agency. He could control his compliance with the physical therapy. He could control his diet, his focus, his willingness to endure the excruciating pain of rehabilitation. He completely ignored the 99% he couldn't control and poured 100% of his psychological energy into the 1% he could.
And it worked.
It did. He survived the experimental procedure, endured the grueling rehab, and against all conceivable medical odds, he returned to the mound. He went on to win 164 more games over the next 13 seasons.
He parsed the difference between the highly unlikely and the genuinely impossible. And that realization really acts as the vital transition point in our journey today. Because once you have steadied your heart rate, once you have used the observing eye to strip away the intimidating narrative, and once you have isolated that tiny 1% of agency you actually possess, you have achieved clarity.
But clarity alone isn't enough.
Exactly. Clarity is completely useless without momentum. Seeing the path out of the forest does not magically teleport you to your living room. You still have to walk out. And that brings us to the engine of this philosophy: action.
Perception precedes action, but action must inevitably follow. And we must define what we mean by action here. We're not talking about frantic, chaotic movement.
Right, running in circles isn't action.
People engage in action all the time. Complaining on the internet, shifting papers on a desk, endlessly planning. That is the illusion of progress. What we are discussing is right action. Right action is deliberate, highly creative, and relentlessly persistent. It is the systematic dismantling of the obstacle, piece by piece. Right action does not wait for ideal conditions, because ideal conditions are a myth. Right action is born in friction.
The sources provide a stunning historical example of this with Demosthenes, the greatest orator of ancient Athens.
Oh, this guy's story is incredible.
If we look at his origin story, he possessed every conceivable excuse to succumb to bitterness and inaction. He was born a frail, sickly child who was frequently bullied at the gymnasium. More devastatingly, he suffered from a severe, paralyzing speech impediment. He could barely articulate a sentence without stuttering.
Which is terrible if you want to be a speaker.
Right. And when he was 7 years old, his father passed away, leaving him a massive fortune meant to secure his education and future. But the guardians entrusted to protect the estate embezzled the funds. They stole his inheritance, refused to pay his tutors, and essentially abandoned him to poverty.
So he was fatherless, mocked by his peers, physically weak, and robbed of his legacy.
The sheer volume of that injustice is staggering. It would be entirely understandable if he had retreated from society, lived quietly, and spent his life complaining about the cruelty of the world. He had a perfectly valid excuse for failure.
But Demosthenes refused the excuse.
He did. He held a vivid memory of witnessing a masterful orator captivate a crowd when he was young, and he decided to channel all his rage, all his humiliation, and all his loss into an obsessive pursuit of that skill. But he didn't just hope for it. He didn't just read books about public speaking. He engaged in brutal, deliberate action.
What did he do?
To conquer his debilitating stutter, he would walk down to the beach, fill his mouth with pebbles, and force himself to clearly enunciate speeches over the roar of the crashing waves.
That sounds agonizing.
It was. And to build the lung capacity he lacked, he would sprint up steep hills while reciting poetry at the top of his lungs. He literally constructed an underground dugout beneath his house, a windowless room where he could practice without distraction.
And he took the concept of removing distractions to an almost manic extreme.
Oh, yeah.
The psychological mechanism here is just fascinating. He knew that the human desire for comfort and social interaction would tempt him to leave his dugout and abandon his grueling practice. So, to physically prevent himself from socializing, he shaved exactly half of his head.
It's just half.
Right. He made himself look completely absurd, ensuring that he would be too humiliated to leave his underground study for months at a time. He engineered his environment to force compliance with his own goals.
He weaponized his own vanity. He stayed down there, practicing his delivery, mastering legal arguments in a mirror, transforming his physical weakness into an overpowering strength. And years later, he emerged. He took the corrupt guardians who had stolen his inheritance to court. He faced down their expensive, seasoned lawyers. And using the thunderous voice he had forged with pebbles and wind, he annihilated their arguments.
Wow.
He won his inheritance back. But more importantly, the specific obstacle of his speech impediment and his poverty forced him to develop a skill that made him the most powerful voice in Athenian politics. When a contemporary asked him to name the 3 most vital traits of effective speech-making, Demosthenes replied, action, action, action. He didn't wait for his stutter to magically disappear, he attacked it.
And that principle, refusing to wait for perfect conditions, is vital for generating momentum. We see this exact dynamic with Amelia Earhart in the 1920s.
Another amazing example.
All right. Aviation was a burgeoning, thrilling field, but society was deeply entrenched in the belief that women were too fragile to handle the physical demands of flying. Earhart desperately wanted to be a great aviator, but she was stuck working as a social worker. Then, she receives a phone call from a group of promoters with an offer to be the first woman to cross the Atlantic in an airplane.
Sounds great until you read the fine print.
Exactly. The offer was layered with profound, insulting sexism.
The contract was appalling. They told her, we will fund the flight, but you will not be allowed to actually touch the controls. 2 male pilots will fly the plane. They will be paid handsomely for the risk. You will be categorized as cargo. You will receive 0 financial compensation, and if the plane crashes, you will still die.
Unbelievable.
It is the definition of a degrading proposition. Any self-respecting person would be tempted to slam the phone down, write an angry editorial, and demand to be treated with equity.
But Earhart understood the physics of momentum. If she rejected the offer out of pride, she would remain a social worker dreaming about airplanes. The conditions were deeply unfair, but they were the only conditions currently available.
She needed to get in the room. Or, well, the plane.
Precisely. She understood that a ship cannot be steered unless it is already moving. So, she swallowed her pride and said yes. She sat in the back of that plane, kept her mouth shut, and crossed the Atlantic as cargo.
But the second she landed...
The instant she landed, she leveraged the massive media attention of the flight to secure funding, build her network, and gain access to aircraft. She used the deeply flawed opportunity as a stepping stone. Less than 5 years later, she dictated her own terms, climbed into the cockpit alone, and became the first woman to fly solo nonstop across the Atlantic. She utilized the obstacle of systemic sexism to gain entry into the room, and once inside, she took over.
So we have established the absolute necessity of getting in motion, of taking that first imperfect step. But sheer momentum without structure quickly leads to burnout.
Right, you just exhaust yourself.
If you were facing a truly colossal problem, like writing a massive book, turning around a failing company, recovering from a severe trauma, the sheer scale of the destination can paralyze you. The sources introduce a crucial cognitive framework for managing this, popularized by the legendary college football coach Nick Saban. He calls it the process.
The process.
When Saban takes over a program, he expressly forbids his players and coaches from focusing on winning the national championship. He doesn't let them talk about the SEC title, the end of season rankings, or even the final score of the upcoming game.
Which sounds completely backwards for a sports team.
Right. But why does he do it? Because the outcome is entirely outside of their direct, immediate control. Obsessing over the championship creates immense, unmanageable anxiety. Instead, Saban forces a microscopic focus on the present reality. He tells the offensive lineman, do not think about the scoreboard. Think exclusively about the exact angle of your right foot on this specific snap. Think only about the placement of your hands on the defender's chest for the next 3 seconds. Execute this single, isolated drill with absolute perfection. And when it is over, you reset and focus on the next isolated drill.
It really is the practical application of cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
Human beings are naturally A to Z thinkers. We look at point A, where we are, and we obsess over point Z, the final victory. The chasm between the two is so vast that it triggers the brain's overwhelm response.
You freeze.
Exactly. The process dismantles that anxiety by demanding that you focus exclusively on point B and then point C. It forces your consciousness to inhabit the present moment. It demands excellence in the microactions, trusting that the macro result will handle itself.
The most visceral analogy I've ever experienced for this is the practice of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Oh, perfect analogy.
Imagine you are sparring and a deeply skilled, much heavier opponent manages to pin you flat on your back. They are crushing your chest, isolating your arms. Your primitive brain screams at you to look at the big picture, which is that you are trapped, you are suffocating, and you are losing.
Panic mode.
If you listen to that panic, you will try to bench press a 200-pound man off of you. You will expend all your cardiovascular energy in a chaotic 10-second explosion. And what happens? You fail. You exhaust yourself, and the opponent simply settles their weight back down, completely controlling you. You defeat yourself through panic.
Right, you did their job for them.
Exactly. But if you have trained your mind to follow the process, you completely ignore the big picture of losing the match. You conserve your oxygen. You focus your entire physical and mental being on a tiny, isolated goal, creating half an inch of space between your hip and the mat. That is your only world. You subtly shift your weight. You trap one of their wrists. You slide your knee into the microscopic gap you created. You don't try to win the fight. You systematically dismantle their mechanical advantage, joint by joint, breath by breath, until you are free.
That is the essence of the process. When the obstacle is overwhelming, you do not look at the summit of the mountain. You look only at the 3 feet of rock immediately in front of your boots. You take the next necessary physical action. But there is a crucial caveat here. What happens when you are executing the process? You're taking step after step, and you suddenly realize the path is genuinely blocked. What if the front door is barricaded by an immovable force? This is where action must become creative. We have to discuss pragmatism and the strategy of the flank attack. The sources provide a legendary case study with Samuel Zemurray, the founder of QML Fruit, which eventually merged with United Fruit.
The Zemurray story is an absolute masterclass in bending reality.
It really is.
So it's 1915, deep in the lush, unforgiving jungles of Central America. 2 massive American corporate entities want to control the same sprawling 5,000-acre tract of highly valuable land for banana cultivation. United Fruit is the behemoth. Zemurray is the scrappy upstart. The massive complication is that nobody knows who actually holds the legal title to the land. 2 different local politicians both possess paperwork claiming ownership, and both are demanding payment.
A total mess.
So how does United Fruit handle it? They default to conventional action. They deploy teams of high-priced Ivy League lawyers to scour the colonial archives. They engage in a slow, agonizing, astronomically expensive legal battle to determine the definitive, singular truth of ownership. They try to break down the front door of the legal system.
And the problem with the front door is that it is always where the heaviest resistance is concentrated. Conventional thinking demands that there's only one right way to solve a legal dispute. But Samuel Zemurray possessed a radical, almost shocking cognitive flexibility. He realized he was not in the business of proving legal theory. He was in the business of growing bananas.
Period.
He didn't care about the conceptual right way. He only cared about the practical way that works.
Exactly. So Zemurray doesn't hire lawyers. He personally rides out, meets with both of the supposed owners separately, and he simply buys the land from both of them. He pays twice for the exact same plot of dirt.
Which sounds crazy.
To United Fruit, this looked like madness, an illegal, chaotic waste of capital. But Zemurray knew the math. The cost of paying both men was a fraction of what United Fruit was spending on attorney fees and lost time. He bypassed the entire legal bottleneck. The dispute vanished instantly, and his workers began planting the next morning. And he operated with this staggering pragmatism his entire life. Years later, he needed to transport bananas across the Utila River. But the local government, which was heavily influenced by bribes from his competitors, passed a specific law stating that Zemurray's company was legally prohibited from building a bridge across that river.
A literal state-sponsored obstacle placed directly in his path. Most people would accept defeat or, perhaps lobby the government for years to overturn the law.
Not Zemery. He reads the exact wording of the law. He tells his engineers to build 2 massive, sturdy piers, one on each side of the river. He builds them so they reach out incredibly far, but they stop just short of meeting in the middle. The river is still technically open. Then, on the days he needs to move his fruit, he simply strings a temporary floating pontoon platform between the 2 piers.
A loophole.
His trains roll across, dump the fruit, and then he pulls the pontoon away. When his furious competitors complained to the authorities, Zemery supposedly laughed and pointed out, "That's no bridge, it's just a couple little old wharfs." He completely ignored the spirit of the law and exploited the physical mechanics of the situation.
This is the definition of a flank attack. In military strategy, a direct frontal assault against a fortified enemy position is almost always a recipe for mutual slaughter. The historian B.H. Liddell Hart conducted an exhaustive analysis of 280 major military campaigns throughout history. The data is shocking.
What did he find?
He discovered that in only 6 of those 280 campaigns was the decisive war-winning victory the result of a direct head-to-head attack. 6 out of 280. George Washington, vastly outmanned and outgunned by the British Empire, understood this deeply. If he lined his troops up in an open field to trade musket fire with the British, the revolution would have ended in a week. Washington embraced evasion. He utilized hit-and-run tactics. He famously crossed the icy Delaware River to attack the Hessian mercenaries at dawn on Christmas Day when they were asleep and hungover.
Very pragmatic.
He refused to play by the honorable rules of European warfare because those rules favored his enemy.
Which forces a very uncomfortable question for the listener. In your own life, with your own massive obstacle, are you exhausting yourself trying to batter down the heavily guarded front door? If you are trying to break into a saturated industry, are you blindly submitting standard resumes to a generic HR portal just like 100,000 other people? That is a frontal assault. You are fighting the odds. The back door, the side windows, the air vents, they are almost always left unguarded. You have to cultivate the cognitive flexibility to work the angles, to realize that the conventional rules of an industry or a conflict are often just suggestions, not immutable laws of physics.
And the highest evolution of the flank attack is realizing that sometimes the most destructive action you can take against an obstacle is to allow the obstacle to destroy itself. You can actually weaponize the kinetic energy of the problem.
Like martial arts.
Exactly. This is the foundational philosophy of martial arts like judo or aikido. When a larger, more aggressive opponent lunges at you with full force, you do not step forward and try to match their strength with a block. You will be crushed. Instead, you step aside, grab their wrist, and pull them in the exact direction they are already moving. You add your slight leverage to their massive momentum, and they throw themselves face first into the mat. You use their own aggressive energy as the weapon that defeats them.
We see this principle beautifully illustrated in the story of a young Alexander the Great taming his legendary horse Bucephalus.
Oh, a classic.
This horse was massive, a magnificent beast, but it was incredibly wild. King Philip's greatest horse trainers tried to break it using the frontal assault method. They used heavy ropes, whips, and sheer brute force to try and force the animal into submission. But the horse fought back with terrifying violence, nearly killing the handlers. The trainers declared the horse useless and untamable.
They gave up.
But young Alexander had the observing eye. He watched the chaos and noticed a crucial detail that everyone else missed. The horse wasn't inherently vicious. It was simply terrified of its own shadow dancing rapidly on the ground during the struggle.
So Alexander changes the entire dynamic. He doesn't bring a whip. He approaches the horse calmly, takes the reins, and physically turns the horse to face directly into the sun. The shadow falls behind the horse, out of its line of sight. The immediate panic subsides.
A shift in perception.
Right. Then Alexander mounts the horse, but instead of fighting the animal's natural instinct to run, he leans forward, holds on tight, and spurs the horse into a full gallop. He lets the horse run as fast as it wants for as long as it wants in a straight line. He allows the horse to expend all of its anxious, explosive energy. He doesn't break the horse. He lets the horse exhaust itself. Once the energy is spent, the horse yields to his command. Alexander used the obstacle's own kinetic energy to achieve his goal.
Moving from the ancient world to a modern, high-stakes political arena, the sources cite the 2008 presidential campaign of Barack Obama as a masterclass in utilizing an opponent's energy.
This is a brilliant move.
During the Democratic primary, the campaign was suddenly engulfed in a massive existential crisis. Inflammatory, highly controversial video clips surfaced of Obama's longtime pastor, Reverend Jeremiah Wright. The media frenzy was absolute. In modern political mechanics, this type of scandal is usually a death blow. The conventional front door playbook dictates that the candidate must immediately hide, issue a heavily sanitized apology, sever all ties, and desperately try to change the news cycle.
But the Obama campaign recognized the sheer uncontrollable momentum of the media cycle. Trying to suppress the story would have been like trying to block a tidal wave with a wooden shield.
Yeah, impossible.
Instead, they executed a political judo throw. Obama stepped directly into the center of the controversy. He utilized the massive, hyper-focused attention generated by the scandal to deliver his landmark A More Perfect Union speech in Philadelphia. He didn't just defend himself. He elevated the crisis into a profound, nuanced national conversation about the complexities of race in America. He took the negative, destructive energy of the scandal and transmuted it into a moment of historic, unifying leadership that essentially secured his nomination. As his advisor Rahm Emanuel famously noted, the philosophy of power dictates that you must never let a serious crisis go to waste. A crisis shatters the calcified status quo. It creates a vacuum of unprecedented opportunity, allowing you to execute structural changes that would be completely impossible during times of peace.
Okay, this is the critical juncture of our deep dive. We have explored the discipline of perception, stripping away our biological panic to see the board clearly. We have dissected the mechanics of action, taking the first step, breaking the problem down, finding the flank attack, and using the enemy's momentum.
Right.
But we have to confront the darkest, most terrifying reality of the human experience. What happens when you do everything right and you still lose?
That happens.
It does. What happens when the supplier bankrupts you despite your best efforts? What happens when the cancer returns? What happens when you are fundamentally stripped of all physical agency and the obstacle in front of you is a solid, unyielding brick wall? When perception and action are exhausted, what is left?
When our external agency is entirely extinguished, we are forced to retreat to the final and undoubtedly the most profound discipline of the Stoic framework, the will. If action is the energy we exert upon the physical world, will is the internal power we cultivate to endure the world when it crushes us. Will is not about bravado. It is not about screaming at the sky or beating your chest in defiance. It is characterized by quiet humility, profound flexibility, deep resilience, and above all, the capacity for surrender. It is the ability to contextualize suffering and extract absolute meaning from the things we cannot change.
To truly understand the weight of the will, we have to examine the life of Abraham Lincoln. In the modern consciousness, Lincoln is carved in marble, the towering, stoic emancipator who guided the nation through its darkest hour. But the historical reality of Lincoln's internal life is a story of almost unrelenting agony.
It really was.
Lincoln suffered from severe clinical depression, a condition known at the time as melancholy. It wasn't just sadness, it was a devastating physiological weight. It was so profound that on at least 2 separate occasions in his young life, his friends had to physically remove all knives and razors from his room because they feared he would take his own life. His life was defined by compounding trauma, the grinding poverty of his youth, the death of his mother, the tragic death of his first love, Anne Rutledge, the loss of his own children, and a string of bruising political defeats.
And yet, when he assumes the presidency, he is immediately tasked with carrying the incomprehensible burden of the American Civil War. He is presiding over the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of his own countrymen. He is dealing with incompetent generals, a viciously divided cabinet, and a hostile press. A lesser mind would have completely fractured under that pressure.
Without a doubt.
But the profound analysis of Lincoln's greatness suggests that it was precisely his lifelong, intimate relationship with profound personal suffering that forged his capacity to lead. Because he had navigated his own internal darkness for decades, he had developed an infinite reservoir of patience, empathy, and heavy endurance. He understood the tragic nature of the human condition. His favorite maxim, which he carried with him, was an ancient Eastern proverb, "This too shall pass." He didn't run from the pain of the war, he absorbed it. He used his own private turmoil as the blueprint for developing the inner strength required to guide a fractured, bleeding nation toward reconciliation with, as he famously said, malice toward none, with charity for all.
He had spent a lifetime constructing what the Stoics call the inner citadel. It is the psychological fortress that protects your core identity when the outside world is laid to waste. And the crucial mechanism of the inner citadel is that it cannot be built during a crisis. You cannot wait until the hurricane is ripping off your roof to start pouring a concrete foundation.
No, it's too late then.
Theodore Roosevelt understood this perfectly. Before he was the robust, larger-than-life Rough Rider, Roosevelt was a terrifyingly frail child in New York City. He suffered from severe, debilitating asthma. In the 19th century, severe asthma was often a death sentence. He would spend nights gasping for air, feeling like he was being slowly suffocated. One day, his father came to him and delivered a blunt, challenging assessment. He said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. And without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. I am giving you the tools, but it is up to you to make your body."
And Roosevelt, this wealthy, pampered, but suffocating kid, looked at his father and replied, "I will make my body." And he didn't just say it. He spent the next 5 years furiously, obsessively working out in a custom gym built on their porch. He lifted weights, he boxed, he hiked. He literally forced the weakness out of his lungs through sheer, painful physical exertion.
Building the citadel.
He was actively constructing his inner citadel. The Stoics recognize that resilience is not a genetic gift. It is a muscle that will atrophy if it's not subjected to resistance. The sources beautifully compare this proactive suffering to the Jewish tradition of the Passover Seder. During the meal, participants intentionally eat bitter herbs and the unleavened bread of affliction. Why inject bitterness into a celebration? Because it is a physical sensory mechanism to visualize and internally possess the endurance, the suffering, and the ultimate triumph of their ancestors. By tasting the bitterness during times of safety, they ensure the muscle of resilience remains deeply conditioned for whatever the future holds.
Which perfectly transitions into one of the most powerful and arguably the most misunderstood tools in the Stoic arsenal. Premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of evils.
A fascinating practice.
The concept is that you actively, vividly visualize the worst-case scenario before you take action. In the modern corporate landscape, this has been adapted into a strategy known as the premortem. Imagine a CEO gathering her executive team in a boardroom 2 days before the launch of a multi-million-dollar product. She stands at the whiteboard and says, "I have terrible news. It is 6 months from now, and this product launch has failed spectacularly. We are facing bankruptcy. The market rejected it entirely. I want you to tell me exactly how and why it died."
They're forcing an exercise in hindsight, but doing it in advance. By demanding that the team vividly inhabit the reality of failure, they bypass the natural human bias toward optimism. They brutally probe their own plan for logistical weaknesses, supply chain vulnerabilities, and marketing blind spots. But more importantly, they are psychologically inoculating themselves against the shock of unpredictability.
But let me push back on this on behalf of anyone who has ever tried to build something.
Sure, go ahead.
If I am pouring my heart and soul into launching a business, and my co-founder comes into the office every single morning obsessing over bankruptcy, lawsuits, and server crashes, I am going to lose my mind. I would argue that constantly anticipating failure kills the necessary delusion of entrepreneurial momentum. Doesn't this practice just turn you into a toxic, paralyzing pessimist?
That is the most common critique, but it fundamentally misunderstands the mechanism. There is a massive psychological difference between anxiety and premeditation.
How so?
Anxiety is an uncontrolled, emotional terror regarding an unpredictable future. It paralyzes you. Premeditation is a controlled, clinical, intellectual exercise. It is putting on a hazmat suit, examining a virus under a microscope, figuring out how it operates, and then taking the suit off. It doesn't make you a pessimist. It makes you robust. If you've already envisioned the collapse of your business and figured out your contingency plan, a sudden market downturn doesn't trigger a panic attack. You aren't caught off guard. You simply open the drawer, pull out the plan you already wrote, and execute it. There is a profound quote from the boxer Mike Tyson. "If you're not humble, life will visit humbleness upon you." The premeditation of evils is the act of choosing to humble yourself before the universe forces you to your knees.
And when the universe does force you to your knees, when the disaster actually strikes, we arrive at what I believe is the most challenging, counterintuitive concept in this entire philosophy. The concept of amor fati, the love of fate, not the acceptance of fate, but the active, fierce love of it.
This is where it gets really deep.
The sources relate an absolutely stunning story about the great inventor Thomas Edison to illustrate the neurological shift required for amor fati. It is December 1914. Edison is 67 years old. He spent his entire life building a massive, sprawling research and production campus in West Orange, New Jersey. One evening, a massive explosion occurs in one of the film buildings. The fire quickly spreads. Because the buildings are packed with highly volatile, bizarre chemicals and early plastics, the fire burns with intense, uncontrollable fury. It is a 6-story inferno.
A total disaster.
Fire engines from 8 surrounding towns rush to the scene, but the water pressure isn't enough. The chemicals laugh at the water. Edison is standing outside in the freezing winter air, watching his entire life's work priceless records, irreplaceable prototypes, massive manufacturing facilities run completely to the ground. He only has a fraction of the necessary insurance. In modern dollars, he is watching hundreds of millions of dollars evaporate into the night sky.
To contextualize this psychologically, the loss of a life's work at the age of 67 is a catastrophic trauma. The vast majority of human beings would drop to their knees and weep. They would curse God, curse the universe, or simply surrender to absolute despair. Their perceiving eye would tell them that their life was effectively over.
But look at the physiological and psychological reaction of Thomas Edison. He is calmly navigating through the chaotic crowd of firefighters and onlookers. He spots his 24-year-old son Charles, who is staring in horror at the flames. Edison approaches him, and with a voice filled with childlike awe and excitement, he says, "Go get your mother and all her friends. They'll never see a fire like this again."
It's just unbelievable.
He looks at his son's shocked face and adds with a smile, "Don't worry, we've just got rid of a lot of rubbish." He literally stood there, warming his hands by the fire, deeply enjoying the magnificent, terrifying spectacle of his own absolute ruin. And this wasn't shock or denial, it was operational. Before the embers were even cool the next morning, he was organizing his teams. He borrowed money, mobilized crews, and within 3 weeks, parts of the factory were operational again. Within a month, they were churning out new iterations of products. Because he refused to be broken, his company generated the modern equivalent of over $200 million in revenue the very next year.
Edison's reaction is the absolute zenith of amor fati. It goes far beyond the art of acquiescence. Acquiescence is Thomas Jefferson recognizing that he possessed a weak, stuttering speaking voice, accepting that limitation, and choosing to channel his genius into the written word of the Declaration of Independence instead. That is smartly accepting a constraint. But amor fati is a chemical, neurological rewiring. It is the ability to look at the fire that is burning your empire to the ground and actively, fiercely loving the flames. Why? Because you genuinely believe that the fire is clearing the dead wood. You love the obstacle because it is forcing you to evolve. You don't just endure the tragedy. You express profound gratitude for it because it is the exact fuel you require for your next iteration. You transform what you must endure into what you get to experience.
The power of that internal reframing is almost magical. The sources provide another incredible visual of this with Jack Johnson, the first African-American world heavyweight boxing champion. He was defending his title against Jim Jeffries, a man who had specifically come out of retirement, heavily promoted as the Great White Hope, who was going to put Johnson in his place. Johnson stepped into the ring in front of a violently hostile, virulently racist crowd. The arena was vibrating with hatred, insults, and threats.
The pressure must have been immense.
If Johnson had allowed his perceiving eye to internalize that hatred, if he had let their rage infect him, he would have fought tight. He would have fought with anger, spiked his cortisol, exhausted his muscles, and likely lost. But Johnson deployed amor fati. He didn't just ignore the crowd. He loved the moment. He smiled. He practically danced around the ring. He happily, effortlessly quipped back at every vile insult thrown from Jeffrey's corner. He projected absolute relaxed joy. The famous writer Jack London was sitting ringside reporting on the fight, and he astutely observed the psychological warfare at play. He wrote, "If ever a man won by nothing more fatiguing than a smile, Johnson won today."
A genuine smile in the face of hatred is a devastating tactical weapon. It completely destabilizes an opponent who is relying on intimidation. Johnson refused to pick up the psychological burden of their bitterness. He embraced the horrific environment entirely on his own terms. Now, when we discuss the concept of enduring the unendurable, we must also examine the architecture of how we relate to the people around us in our darkest hours. The sources bring focus to the harrowing experience of Vice Admiral James Stockdale.
Stockdale's story forces us to look at the absolute limits of human endurance. He was an American fighter pilot shot down over North Vietnam in 1965. He spent over 7 years as a prisoner of war in the notorious Hanoi Hilton. For 2 of those years, he was locked in solitary confinement, in the dark, with heavy leg irons bolted to his ankles. He was the highest-ranking naval officer captured, and he knew instantly that his captors would subject him to relentless torture to break him and use him for propaganda. He recognized that his physical fate, the beatings, the starvation, the isolation, was entirely out of his control. The obstacle is insurmountable.
Stockdale was a deep student of Stoicism, particularly Epictetus, and he also understood the psychological dynamics of POW camps from studying the Korean War. He knew that when human beings are subjected to extreme trauma, the natural biological instinct is to retreat inward, to focus entirely on self-preservation. But he also knew the data. When prisoners isolate themselves, when they adopt an every man for himself mentality, they inevitably break under torture, turn on each other, and lose their humanity. So Stockdale made a profound tactical decision regarding his will. He intentionally shifted his psychological focus completely away from his own pain. He stopped worrying about his own survival and focused entirely on leading and protecting the men in the cells around him.
He constructed an elaborate clandestine support network. They developed a tap code to communicate through the concrete walls. He established a chain of command. He provided them with a guiding philosophy and a watchword: unity over self. When men were dragged back from the torture rooms, broken in a shame that they had confessed, the network was there to tap messages of forgiveness and solidarity, bringing them back into the fold. John McCain, who was held in a nearby cell, utilized the exact same principle. Because McCain's father was the commander of all U.S. forces in the Pacific, the North Vietnamese offered McCain early, unconditional release to score a massive propaganda victory. McCain was suffering from untreated broken bones, dysentery, and torture. He desperately wanted to go home, but he consulted the POW Code of Conduct, which stated prisoners must be released in the order they were captured. He looked at his captors and refused to leave unless every man captured before him was released as well. He actively chose years of continued torture over betraying that unity.
The neurological and psychological lesson here is profound. When we are trapped in the darkness of an unsolvable problem, our ego magnifies our pain. But when we actively choose to focus on the suffering of others, when we dedicate ourselves to a cause greater than our own preservation, our own personal fears miraculously diminish. The burden becomes lighter because it is shared. If you are facing a truly intractable, impossible obstacle in your life, and you cannot find a way to solve it for yourself, the most empowering psychological pivot you can make is to ask, how can I use this horrific situation to benefit someone else? Becoming a source of strength for others forces you to access reserves of endurance you did not know you possessed. It gives you profound purpose when all other avenues of agency have been destroyed.
It gives you a mission in the dark. And speaking of the ultimate darkness, the sources conclude this exploration of the will with the ultimate, unavoidable obstacle that every single one of us must face: our own mortality. In 1569, a French nobleman and philosopher named Michel de Montaigne was outrighted when he was violently flung from a galloping horse. The impact was devastating. He was covered in blood, slipping in and out of consciousness. His friends carried his limp body home, convinced he was dead. Montaigne lay there, fully aware that his life was slipping away. He later wrote about feeling his soul dancing on his lips, preparing to depart. But against all odds, he survived the trauma. And the fascinating outcome is that this near-death experience didn't leave him paralyzed with PTSD or an intense fear of the world. It completely energized him.
He realized that the subconscious fear of death is the engine that drives almost all of our petty anxieties. It makes us obsessive, greedy, and fearful. Once he had physically looked death in the face and survived, he embraced the ancient Stoic practice of memento mori, the Latin phrase meaning, remember that you must die. To the modern ear, deliberately meditating on your own death sounds incredibly morbid, like a recipe for depression.
Right, it sounds like you'd just give up. Why try if we're all going to die anyway?
But the psychological reality is the exact opposite. The Stoics use memento mori as a tool for profound, piercing clarity. Acknowledging the absolute certainty in the ticking clock of your own mortality strips away the agonizing cognitive clutter of daily life. If you deeply internalize the fact that your time on this earth is painfully finite, you instantly stop obsessing over trivialities. You stop caring about the snide comment a coworker made. You lose your fear of looking foolish because what does it matter if you fail a business venture when you are eventually going to be dust? Acknowledging death creates an intense, clarifying urgency. It forces you to treat your time as the ultimate, irreplaceable gift. It forces you to stop complaining about how you wish the world operated and demands that you start engaging fiercely with the world exactly as it is.
Which brings us full circle. It brings us to the ultimate synthesis of everything we have unpacked today: the fluidity of perception, action, and will.
It is a continuous reinforcing loop. We must train our minds to see things objectively for what they truly are, stripping away the panic in the narrative, that is, perception. We must engage the physical world with relentless, creative, pragmatic energy, breaking the problem down and working the angles, that is action. And we must cultivate the internal fortitude to endure, to love our fate, and to serve others when our agency is gone, that is will. Look back at Marcus Aurelius, the man sitting in the freezing tent where we began. Late in his reign, he received the devastating news that Avidius Cassius, his most trusted general and a close friend, had launched a rebellion in Syria and declared himself emperor. Marcus had every historical and legal right to fly into a murderous rage, to let his perceiving eye demand bloody vengeance. But he didn't. He controlled his perception. He viewed the betrayal objectively, recognizing the political pressures that drove Cassius.
He refused to take it as a personal insult to his ego.
Precisely. And then he took swift, decisive action. He marched his legions eastward to secure the borders and stabilize the empire. But it was his will, his guiding internal philosophy, that dictated the outcome. He didn't use the crisis to execute his enemies. He saw this terrible, heartbreaking betrayal as profound opportunity. He told his legions that they were going to capture Cassius, not to impale him, but to forgive him. He wanted to demonstrate to the Roman world the right way to navigate a civil war. He used the immense obstacle of treason to publicly demonstrate the ultimate virtue of clemency. He took the worst possible scenario, threw it onto the blazing fire of his own character, and it only made his fire burn brighter.
And that is the exact mechanical operating system we want you to take away from this deep dive. The philosophy of Stoicism, the core realization that the obstacle is the way, is not a collection of inspiring quotes meant to sit on a dusty library shelf. It is a highly practical toolkit for surviving and thriving in the harsh, unpredictable realities of your actual life. Every single time a competitor steals your proprietary idea, every time the housing market crashes and wipes out your equity, every time a global pandemic shatters your carefully laid plans, you are faced with a fundamental choice. Will you allow your amygdala to paralyze you? Will you let your perceiving eye tell you a tragic story of your own demise? Or will you take a breath, find the 1% you can control, execute the flank attack, and actively use the impediment as the exact fuel you need to advance?
There was a Haitian proverb mentioned in the sources that perfectly and somewhat brutally captures the reality of this framework. Behind mountains are more mountains. The goal of overcoming an obstacle is not to magically unlock some mythical utopian land where friction no longer exists. That land does not exist. The human experience is a marathon of breaking through increasingly fortified lines. Passing one obstacle simply means you have evolved. You have grown stronger, your perception is sharper, your actions are more refined, and your will is deeper. You are simply now worthy of facing a bigger, more complex, and more meaningful challenge.
It is the ultimate reframe of the human struggle. And so as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative challenge. I want you to think back to that single most frustrating, unfair, agonizing roadblock in your life right now that we talked about at the very beginning of this hour. Picture it clearly in your mind. Feel the friction of it. Now, what if you absolutely had to view it as the exact necessary fuel you needed to become the person you are meant to be? If you had to look at that terrifying roadblock, strip away the narrative, and just smile at it, what would your very next physical step be?
The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Take that next step today. We will see you next time.